about
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
Hello, everybody. Wanted to say hi to Rebecca and hi to those of you that are joining us. Our opening session got us a couple minutes behind this morning, but I'm going to go over and make a post in the app letting everyone know that they can head this way. And Rebecca, you're welcome to get started whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kimberly. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Great. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome, friends. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to be presenting at Take Root. This is my first Take Root conference, so I'm so honored to be here. My presentation today largely focuses on recent dissertation work that I completed, which really centrally revolved around the question that you see here on your screen, which is coincidentally the title of my presentation today. And that question is, what do we talk about when we talk about reproductive health care? And since there are not too many of us in here, I encourage an open conversation as I go through my presentation. I do have quite a lot of slides, so if you have any questions or if you would like to interject during the presentation, let's talk. Let's foster more of a discussion perhaps, but if not, I will go straight through my slides and we can leave the Q&A for last. So by training, I think I should preface this presentation. I am an organizational communications scholar, and as an organizational communications scholar, my research is really built around the process of creating and negotiating collective coordinated systems of meaning through various symbolic practices that are oriented toward the achievement of specific organizational goals. And as such, I am really interested in how reproductive healthcare is talked about by various organizations in the repro space that ultimately stake a claim in this repro territory, and how conceptualizations of reproductive healthcare perhaps simultaneously advance and hinder our understandings of the concept. So today I will walk you through different aspects of my project, which I'm currently in the process of breaking up into smaller pieces. So first, I'll provide an overview around how I have situated reproductive health care. I will then discuss some of the theory that I used to support this study, which will hopefully be somewhat interesting to you, but I think it's important to kind of just talk about that a little bit, what I drew from, some of that organizational theory, which will then be discussed by my methods. I'll talk you through who I spoke with, the process of speaking to folks. It was a lot, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Then I will talk through my findings. And under the umbrella of the major question that I was interested in, again, what do we talk about when we talk about reproductive health care? I'll present an overview of 3 of the chapters that I developed for this specific project that kind of falls under that question. And then finally, I will dig into the implications and the limitations, some of the directions that I'm hoping to go toward and build this project. I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts, and then we'll do that during our question and answer session. So again, I think it's important to begin this presentation with how I approached communication during this project, specifically as a communication scholar interested in how reproductive health care is communicated. So the central question I ask, again, the title of my presentation, it literally hinges on an understanding of communication. And I looked at the definition of communication that is currently on your screen to support my project. And this definition really emphasizes that communication is a link that relates beings to one another. It relates us to one another. It must materialize or manifest into something or someone in order to really occur. So as communicative beings, our social realities are really the living matters, or our interests and facts and power and autonomy that link us as people to things and situations, ultimately matters of concern that are most significant to us. For this project, I was interested in who or what expresses and communicates the social realities of reproductive health care from an organizational communication perspective, specifically in the context of Texas. And I'm sure some of you recognize this, this aggravating photo that is currently on the slide. But when I talk about social realities, I'm ultimately referring to a reality or a fact of life that is particular to a specific society, or specifically a reality as conceived by particular folks in high power places. And as I'm sure you are all very much well aware, Texas has an interesting, complicating, frustrating, precarious history with reproductive health care. And most recently, as we know, the legislature approved and has implemented the 6-week abortion ban, which has kind of been going back and forth in a legal battle, but it has been very frustrating geography, a reproductive health care geography in the state of Texas. But along with politicians and legislatures who we just saw previously on the screen, they are not the only entities or people that enable and constrain the social realities of how we understand and communicate about reproductive health care. A brief capture of recent news headlines about the Texas legislature's 6-week abortion ban from May 2021 that you see on your screen show the disparate use of language around reproductive health care across news outlets. So from this quick glance, we see words and phrases from these news titles or headlines such as pro-life versus pro-choice, both sides, quote unquote, women's rights, reproductive health care, all out assault on reproductive health. And so since the start of this project, I had difficulties, honestly, locating a definition of what reproductive health care is, because it is oftentimes conceptualized in terms of these very intractable binaries, right? Pro-life, pro-choice, pro-abortion, anti-abortion. And there is far more complexity to reproductive health care, which is an issue that is incredibly polarized, even beyond these binary categorizations. So for this project, I chose not to align with existing binaries or really to distinguish between reproductive health and reproductive health care. So that's why you see care in parentheses here. And this was a decision that I made and I still am grappling with, and am not entirely okay with this decision that I made. But again, it just shows the struggle that I had really locating how we should talk about reproductive health care, or at least in the parameters of this project. And I would love to discuss that with you at the end of this presentation. So instead, I used both concepts, both reproductive health and reproductive health care, simultaneously and interchangeably, ultimately recognizing reproductive health care as a state of being, a mode of care, delivery, and service, and a collective of organizations and agencies and actors that support and sustain and constrain the state and the mode of reproductive health and reproductive health care. And while it may seem that the landscape of people and objects and things that constitute or comprise reproductive health care, specifically in Texas, are or seem very much identifiable, I was really primarily interested in the what and the who are seen as secondary or remain background in these conversations around reproductive health care. The what are the organizations such as abortion funds and political advocacy initiatives, and the who are the organizers such as the workers and the activists, helpline coordinators, community engagement specialists that work in grassroots capacities and are often overshadowed by other powerful mainstream actors and organizations. So as we know and are very much well aware, again, these organizations and organizers are oftentimes situated within the 3 dominant reproductive frameworks: the rights, justice, and health framework. Each framework and the organizations that situate themselves within these specific frameworks tend to conceptualize reproductive health care very differently. So as we know from the perspective of the reproductive rights framework, reproductive health care is very much communicatively framed through the legalities of abortion, right? Rights-based constructs such as freedom and choice and privacy and autonomy. Organizations operating within this framework, as again, we very much well know, use legislative initiatives and political campaigns and advocacy initiatives for legal rights and freedoms relating to reproductive health care. The reproductive justice framework, on the other hand, communicates about reproductive health care by drawing more so from a broader, all-encompassing continuum of issues that affect all reproductive bodies. And this, as we know, includes racial and food and climate justice and prison abolition. As such, these organizations are dedicated to building grassroots coalitions of individuals and organizations to improve institutional policies and to destabilize oppressive, racist, classist systems that impact the reproductive lives of all of us, but most particularly marginalized communities. And then lastly, the reproductive health framework communicates about reproductive health care in a very resource-driven way that addresses inaccessibility to healthcare research and services and facilities. And organizations within this framework or who subscribe to this framework are those that support access to and the implementation of reproductive health care. So taken together, these three frameworks, which we are very much well aware of, have different conceptualizations of what reproductive health care is and communicate reproductive health care in very different ways depending on the tenets of their frameworks. But for this project, I was also really interested in this question, this very controversial question. Crisis pregnancy centers and other similar organizations do arguably in some way talk about reproductive health care, even though they don't explicitly identify as doing reproductive work or work related to reproductive health care in the ways that the rights, justice, and health frameworks do. And I was really interested in how crisis pregnancy centers fit within this reproductive health care landscape. How do they talk about reproductive health care, specifically within the context of Texas? And I felt that adding this question to this project, this large project, would be appropriate because CPCs have such a commanding presence in Texas, and to ignore what they are saying in this realm and in this sphere, I think would have done a disservice to this project. So, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but I did speak with quite a bit of folks from CPCs, and it was very interesting, let me tell you. So when we talk about CPCs, we know that we are talking about very controversial organizations. They're nonprofit, they're anti-abortion, oftentimes affiliated with religion. They are organizations that provide free services to people who are grappling with unintended pregnancies under very dissuasive tactics, very unethical tactics. And oftentimes we know they try to persuade people with free resources such as diapers and clothing and food and parenting classes. And again, just as we know, very controversial. So one of the most interesting finds of my project I found revolved around the observation that reproductive rights, justice, and health organizations and CPCs, specifically within the context of Texas, because that was my research context, exist within something called, or I called, a reproductive domain. And this reproductive domain is a collective space where these organizations, conversations and interactions and transactions and sense-making and meaning-making take place around reproductive healthcare and inform how we understand what reproductive healthcare is. This is because these organizations ultimately, regardless of their principles, frameworks, and values, indirectly support reproductive health care in the work that they do and in the services and resources that they provide. And I argue that there is value in analyzing all of these organizations as a collective in this domain because all of these organizations contribute to the meaningful production of reproductive health care. And I'm interested, and was primarily interested, in this collective contested space of the reproductive domain and not necessarily one particular organization. So I was really interested in what was happening kind of in the global context of things. So to understand the complexities or the voices that are simultaneously speaking within the reproductive domain that I just showed, I adopted a theoretical approach called the communicative constitution of organizations, or known as the CCO approach. And bear with me, this is a little theory heavy, but I do think it adds value to my presentation so you can understand where I was coming from and what theory I ended up using to really build this project and to support what my argument was. So adopting this theoretical approach essentially means studying how processes of communication ultimately produce an organization's identity and existence through the relations and the interactions and the talk or the discourse that takes place within these organizations between workers and volunteers, both human and non-human. And when I talk about non-human things, I'm talking about objects like the materials or the pamphlets that are created within the organizations, the values or the mission statements that are espoused by the organizations, those very non-human but very tangible things that ultimately comprise and inform an organization's existence. So in this way, I am arguing that organizations are manifested through communication. And as such, applying this theoretical framework can show us how reproductive healthcare is produced and given agency in very particular contexts. So to kind of put it into a little bit more of a concrete context, the approach that I took, the theoretical approach I took, positions an organization's existence as something that is achieved through communication, specifically how organizations are materialized through various speech acts or discourse or talks, such as text and conversation. So when I talk about text or texts, texts are the stable artifacts that provide the foundation for an organization, such as, like I said before, mission statements and press releases, anything that really constitutes an organization within written words. Conversations put those texts into action. And so it is through conversation or shared interaction where organizational actors articulate their organization's purpose and values and principles. So we see shared interaction, shared talk take place in the form of television appearances, for example, demonstrations, protests, or rallies, and even at volunteer events. And taken together, texts and conversations oftentimes work in tandem with each other to produce an organization in various ways through how an organization presents itself outwardly to the world. And how an organization presents itself really very much matters, and we should care about this because the material manifestations of organizational being enables organizations to answer questions regarding who they are and why they are authorized to speak or act on behalf of certain issues or problems or topics. And this is really at the root of how organizations, or how I'm really curious about how organizations within the rights, health, and justice frameworks, as well as CPCs, talk about reproductive healthcare and center our social realities of how we construct what reproductive healthcare means. And so through these processes, these various actors and humans and things, such as, again, those press releases and those very material text things that speak on behalf of an organization, must attribute their actions to the organization in order to present it and make it possible as such. So for example, it can be said that activists and executive members who articulate reproductive health care as a right and a choice on behalf of Planned Parenthood in this hypothetical example, must attribute this action to Planned Parenthood in order to really enhance and to make the organization's existence palpable, right, tangible. And one such method that can really guide our understanding of how certain figures or certain people are authorized to speak on behalf of an organization over others is the metaphor of ventriloquism. So when we think about ventriloquism, we think about how ventriloquism really demonstrates how organizations are made present through this interplay of various forms of agency and interaction. And as the ventriloquist, and continuing this metaphor, as the ventriloquist or vent, which is known in the artistic performance of ventriloquism, and figure or puppet interact, they animate each other. So it is specifically their relationship of attachment, which you see here in this photo, their connections and interdependence with one another that allow them to speak simultaneously as distinct figures and as a collective. So in this case, the figure could be a figurehead of an organization, and that vent, that person who is animating that puppet, could be the organization animating that figure on behalf of the organization. And this is really fascinating in terms of understanding the context of what reproductive healthcare is through the eyes of both the vent, the ventriloquist, and the figure. So continuing from the previous example, we can say that Planned Parenthood activists are ventriloquized or puppeteered by the organization to speak on its behalf through material things that they create or carry, or in the demonstrations that they participate in, the signs and the pamphlets that they create, reinforcing their messages and their talk. At the same time, the activists position themselves to be ventriloquized through their organizational membership identification, where their roles and actions are shared and negotiated and aligned with the values and principles and ideologies of Planned Parenthood. In this way, taking the metaphor of ventriloquism really allows us to look very closely at the multiple tensional communicative acts that take place at a given time between collectives of beings and figures that produce an organization's existence. And in this case, organizations that are speaking about reproductive healthcare and making that talk a reality. So based on my review of literature and the theories that I was interested in supporting my project, I ultimately developed 3 research questions that guided my data collection and analysis and who I ultimately spoke with for this project. And so the first question I explored, how do organizational members in the reproductive domain communicatively constitute reproductive healthcare, explored that tensional space of the reproductive domain, specifically how organizations position what reproductive healthcare is and means according to their principles and ideologies, discourses, and frameworks that their organizations support. The second research question, which is how is member identification in the reproductive domain animated and constrained by the values and beliefs and ideologies and positions of members' organizations, was principally concerned with how organizational members position themselves to speak on behalf of their organizations through their identification with their organizations, through that identity that they have built and shared within that organizational context. Member identification is ultimately a process of where an individual's roles and actions are defined and redefined and negotiated and renegotiated, informing ultimately how an individual situates themselves within their organization. And through member identification, an organization is realized and made apparent and tangible through its collective member base. And lastly, the communicative constitution of organizations approach, which I just provided an overview of, really invites us to consider organizations as conflicted sites of human activity. And theorizing reproductive healthcare as a site of conflicted activity in this way, as a very contested, conflicted place, can visualize a very tensional landscape of various levels of communicative encounters. And so this thinking led to ultimately to the third question, which revolves around how members engaged in reproductive work, experience and constitute an effective embodied landscape of reproductive healthcare. And for this particular question, I created a series of maps called intimate maps, which I will show you as we progress through this presentation. But again, really using those effective embodied experiences of repro workers and how that kind of fits to the landscape of their experiences engaging in repro work and ultimately informing understandings of reproductive health care. So to really engage and answer or attempt to answer my research questions, I employed two methods. I conducted virtual interviews and I did an exercise in mapping, but this was not the original design of my study. So prior to COVID-19, I had plans to conduct an analysis of an abortion clinic and a crisis pregnancy center in the same community within Texas during the summer of 2020. But unfortunately, COVID-19 drastically changed my plans and altered the political dynamic around reproductive healthcare in Texas in really drastic ways too. But not only in Texas, everywhere. So I quickly had to adapt my project, and I literally identified and contacted all operating abortion clinics, crisis pregnancy centers, abortion funds, fertility clinics, advocacy initiatives, and other related organizations in Texas. This ultimately resulted in me contacting and following up with 227 organizations. So over the course of April through July of 2020, I interviewed 67 people over Zoom, including executive directors, volunteers, front desk workers, educators, activists, and program directors across all of the organizations that I identified. And the interviews were really designed to gain an understanding of organizational members, not only their levels of identification with their organizations, but how reproductive healthcare is talked about in their daily work and within their communities. So I drew from a qualitative method of analysis to identify themes that evolved and came out of my research questions. So my data analysis was largely informed by identifying themes related to these central issues. So then I drew from this interview data that I collected from these 67 folks to create a map of the participants' repro work and reproductive healthcare experiences. And these experiences are really drawn from a complex communicative felt connection that exists within the participants' stories of their repro work. And again, I was talking with these participants during the height of COVID. So I had some really intense conversations. And so the map that I will show you later in my presentation brings together communication or how reproductive health and healthcare experiences are talked about, but also attempts to meld that with geographic considerations, specifically looking at the state of Texas and really understanding and realizing how large the state of Texas truly is and how many barriers geography does present reproductive healthcare experiences. So at this time, I'm going to shift toward the details of my findings. I will begin with my first chapter, which explores how members of from the reproductive domain play a critical role in really talking about or talking reproductive healthcare realities into something that is very tangible and concrete. I am mindful of the time, so the rest of this presentation will just be dedicated to the findings and some of the implications and the future directions that I am taking. So as I previously discussed, the reproductive domain is a collective space where reproductive rights and justice and health organizations and CPCs conversations, interactions and transactions and sense making express and constitute and continually constitute reproductive healthcare. And the organizations within the reproductive domain are in constant competition to claim what reproductive healthcare is and what it means in this shared space. And the effects of this are made incredibly palpable in the ways that certain articulations of reproductive healthcare are vocalized while others are silenced and excluded, both intentionally and unintentionally. So members of the reproductive domain drew upon three identifiable clusters of discourse to provide or produce a definition of what reproductive healthcare is. And this is what I identified from my interviews with the 67 folks that I spoke with. So these three clusters of discourse ended up being reproductive healthcare became an aspect of women's health or was articulated as an aspect of women's health. Reproductive healthcare was articulated as an aspect of human health. And reproductive healthcare was articulated as a euphemism for abortion, which was very interesting. So the discourse clusters contribute to this simultaneous messiness and strategic application to really invoke or enforce organizational goals and uphold missions and principles and values across this reproductive domain. So first, some participants used the phrase women's health to describe the focus of their work in addressing clients' mental, physical, and emotional well-being. So these interviews tended to contrast their holistic approach to health and well-being to the very limited and specific role of reproductive healthcare, which they considered to be very limited to the physical functionality of reproductive organs with the specific goal of childbearing as demonstrated in Holly's excerpt that you see here on the screen. So this discourse cluster, reproductive healthcare as women's health, also assumes the existence of a finite category of women distinct from outgroup members. So a focus on reproductive functionality in this way excludes other groups of communities of people that do not fit into the category of women that Holly is really articulating here on the screen. So for example, LGBTQIA+ folks, right? They are not in this very finite category of women. So in contrast to the first discourse cluster, reproductive healthcare as human health perceives women's health as ignoring reproductive health needs beyond cisgender women's efforts at childbearing, as demonstrated in Erica's visceral commentary here. So from the perspective of the reproductive frameworks, all people, regardless of gender identity, fertility, sexual activity, have reproductive healthcare needs, and we know this. As such, this discourse cluster assumes gender identity exists on a spectrum rather than a binary, and that identity can be fluid over time. So regardless of gender identity and or sexuality, this discourse cluster really asserts that all humans have reproductive healthcare needs. And finally, reproductive healthcare was applied as a euphemism for abortion across the reproductive domain through the use of strategic ambiguity. And when I talk about strategic ambiguity really utilizes equivocality or openness to interpretation, which can promote a unified diversity while also allowing for the pursuit of conflicting goals. And this is demonstrated in VH's excerpt that you see on the screen, where VH uses abortion in certain contexts and women's reproductive health in other contexts, in other contexts, for example, for strategic marketing purposes when appealing to certain clients or demographics of people. And this could be seen as very strategic on VH's part, but also very problematic because VH is not necessarily being very clear in what they are saying when they are using one phrase over another to talk about reproductive health care. And this was a very interesting point that came up. So based on the results and the high-level results that I just presented of my first kind of study or analysis chapter, I was then interested in moving a little bit deeper into how organizational members position themselves to speak on behalf of their organization's values and matters of concerns and principles and ideologies through their member identification with their organizations. So from my interviews with the 67 folks I spoke with, I found that the participants' member identification with their organizations was ultimately activated by 4 very tensional value figures that were central to their organization's existences. And these value figures included equity, care, purpose, and scarcity. So the participants referred to equity as a figure. Equity refers to efforts to transform their organizational spaces to create new, open, equitable spaces for the people that they serve. So here, member identification often materialized in the form of participants really enacting and upholding values of the reproductive frameworks that they were associated with organizationally through community dialogues and events, and serving as a model other organization for similar organizations. The second figure, which manifested as care, was really articulated by participants as both immaterial care and material care. So immaterial forms of care were framed as providing love and support and giving literally a hand up. Somebody did this gesture when they were telling me how they give people a hand up. Material care, on the other hand, manifested in the services and the resources organizations provided, such as transportation, childcare, and funds. And I will tell you that immaterial care was more often articulated by folks who were associated with CPCs than actual material care. Material care was oftentimes really evoked and really brought up by the folks who were associated with the organizations under the reproductive framework. So we might not be surprised by that, but again, kind of just articulating that, the differences in organizations within the reproductive domain. I showed a couple slides back is important to talk about and recognize. So the third figure, purpose, was ultimately activated by the participants' work through work callings, but in 2 senses of work calling. So there was work calling that manifested in a religious sense, so people who told me that they were doing God's work, and in a service-oriented approach. People who were doing or providing care no matter what, a famous slogan from an organization we probably all know, and literally working ourselves out of a job, right? Using a service-oriented approach to purpose to work themselves out of a job so there's no longer a need for them because their goals would ultimately be achieved. And the final figure, which was scarcity, was ultimately contextualized as a lack of some things or someone's and centered around a diminished capacity and burnout and lack of funding to sustain organizations and restrictive legislation that limited organizational purpose. So the ways that participants' member identification was activated by these value figures was oftentimes very imperfect and at times constrained by conflicting personal interests. So the discrepancies that existed in the in-between spaces of these value figures you see here on the screen brought attention to the fissures and the cracks of member identification in ways that illuminated the frustrations and the emotional, physical labor of reproductive healthcare related work. So on one end, these folks that I spoke with were trying to uphold and articulate these value figures on behalf of their organization, but on the other end, their personal identity and interests were also conflicting with these 4 value figures, and that caused a lot of tension. So the findings that I presented in the previous 2 sections really explored how talk and discourse and member identification animated my participants' understandings of what reproductive healthcare means in the context of their work. So this final chapter that I wrote really took a broader transdisciplinary approach. It is the mapping chapter. So it engages geographic considerations. So it considers larger communicative and socio-political forces that really make up Texas's reproductive domain through this project that I spoke about called intimate mapping. So intimate maps, as you see here on the screen, this is the one that I created. Intimate maps are alternative visualizations of space with the goal of accounting for power-laden political and emotional site markings and encounters. So intimate maps are ultimately a response to traditional maps that tend to erase or omit stories that play a very active role in constructing public spaces and our social realities. So in this way, intimate maps are exciting because they are techniques that can be considered counter-mapping efforts that resist traditional forms of visualization and scale and distancing, and instead centering a sensorial approach comprised of sound and feelings and smell and taste and the way bodies and objects meet and touch and really kind of converge here on the map. So the intimate map I created for this project articulates many of these socio-political, communicative, and very much geographic experiences and obstacles and emotions and feelings that constitute reproductive work and what reproductive healthcare means in the state of Texas. So intimate flows, so we have the intimate map, the flows that you see on the screen that I have taken screenshots here of, they are the stuff that constitutes the map. They consist of the participants' embodied communicative experiences and stories and ideas and the complexities around their reproductive work and healthcare experiences in Texas. They also demonstrate the realities of policies and legislations and barriers and disparity that maintain, structure, and reshape what it means to do reproductive work in Texas and to be a part of this very historically challenging reproductive landscape. Intimate flows are ultimately meant to generate and problematize and trouble this landscape in which they are situated and contour, and they enable and constrain the map and welcome new interpretations upon each reading of the intimate map. So based on the interviews that I conducted, I identified 12 intimate flows by tracing participants' references to space and place and geography. And this included participants' references to travel restrictions, barriers, and borders, transportation and driving distances, maps or references to mapping, specific areas or regions in Texas, and surrounding states, surrounding border states, as well as Mexico, and locality, policy, and undocumented population. So each intimate flow was situated according to the interviewee's location, regional references, and specific mention of cities and areas of Texas and beyond. So the intimate flows were ultimately cataloged into two loose categories that you see here on the screen: intimate flows of distance and time, and intimate flows of barriers. So intimate flows of distance and time ultimately really simultaneously refers to traveling extreme distances across, within, and outside of Texas. So car miles, mobility and access to transportation, and duration. So when I'm speaking about durations, I'm oftentimes referring to the hours or the process that it takes to get from point A to point B. So these intimate flows of distance and time also illustrate the complexities of time off, or as somebody put it, borrowed time, which refers to dedicating organizing power to helping clients arrange childcare and negotiate time off from work. In this sense, time off or borrowed time really affects distances that must be traveled in order to receive reproductive health care or abortion care. Oftentimes, I found that intimate flows of distance and time projected exasperation and urgency and frustration, feelings and emotions that materialize the adverse effects of distance and time within Texas's reproductive domain and on the map that you see here. So the second strain of intimate flows really brought together intimate flows that consider how barriers constitute Texas's reproductive healthcare landscape. And the sociopolitical context that the reproductive domain or workers within repro or the reproductive domain are faced with provides various insights into how their organizing capacities and work are relational accomplishments that are oftentimes affected by these various types of barriers. And so many times intimate flows within this collection really position barriers as both physical and invisible boundaries that block, border, limit, restrict, prevent, barricade, discipline, police, and hinder reproductive health care access in and around Texas. So such effects can be heard and felt when the intimate flows invoke words and phrases such as trust barrier, forced to choose, travel, or carry an unwanted pregnancy, immigration status, barriers, checkpoints, and trigger laws. So as communicative forms and ways that really manifest and materialize what reproductive health care means, the intimate flows made visible what is oftentimes invisible, the active role the reproductive domain workers have in shaping and reshaping reproductive health care across Texas through their experiences. This intimate mapping, while perhaps chaotic and at times challenging to follow, ultimately conveys the messy assemblage of things and ideas and feelings and web of people that constitute Texas's reproductive health care landscape. So taken together, each of my findings, each of the 3 segments that I presented offers something unique to the constitution of reproductive health care. I will conclude this presentation with the remaining time that I have left. I'm discussing the implications of the findings and the limitations and some future directions that might propel this study forward. And I'm so excited to hear and speak with all of you just about your thoughts and reactions and questions. So this project ultimately forwards 3 key implications around the constitution of how we understand reproductive health care through our talk and through our discourses, namely the implications of membership identification and geographic considerations, and how, like we talked about before, text and conversation really meet and merge to form these very tangible understandings. So first, the 3 discourse clusters that I previously spoke about exist simultaneously and exist in competition with one another to really mobilize the constitution of reproductive healthcare. These discourse clusters have the potential to destabilize organizations' tunnel vision of what reproductive healthcare is and means by demonstrating how conflicting positions and interpretations can exist at one time. This might be controversial, I'm not sure, but not one interpretation of reproductive health care is necessarily right or wrong. Rather, they each contribute to the constitution of reproductive health care in different ways. This can only happen when one breaks through or dislodges from those rigid binary categories that constrain reproductive health care. Therefore, I argue that it is critical that organizations within the reproductive domain recognize that these clusters of discourses that are identified on your screen simultaneously exist and contribute to the social realities of reproductive health care and the barriers, support, and care and access and policies that are influenced by these very social realities. Second, within the reproductive domain, imperfect member identification occurred in the in-between spaces of each value figure. Imperfect identification is the friction that occurred when members' personal interests contradicted or clashed with their organizations. Imperfect identification really actually provides several opportunities for employers and organizational members in the reproductive domain to create opportunities for coalition building and interorganizational partnerships that might not have existed before, especially between the rights, justice, and health organizations. And I'm sure we are all in touch with Twitter, but I've been recently seeing out of the account of Repro Jobs that there is a lot of upheaval currently happening within organizations and a discrepancy between workers and volunteers and the upper level executives, right? So this might be a really interesting opportunity to explore some of this imperfect membership identification in the in-between spaces of these value figures here on the screen. I think imperfect identification can also bring attention to the weaknesses in organizational missions, and ultimately, I think reorienting principles and values toward more productive organizational goals would be very beneficial for some organizations that refuse to change or really just really do refuse to change. So lastly, the intimate mapping produced an advocacy, storytelling, and testimonial artifact that can enable people to ultimately really see beyond their sight, to situate themselves in places that they perhaps will never travel or experience. Not all of us will be traveling to medical deserts in Texas, so the intimate map might give us some insight into the struggles that exist in medical deserts within the state of Texas. So as such, organizations within the reproductive domain can make an effective visual case that conveys how various barriers and borders and access issues constrain reproductive healthcare and their reproductive work. Ultimately, I argue the intimate map brings realities of reproductive healthcare constraints and limitations that may be understood as rumor, word of mouth, or flight of fancy to those who have never experienced these realities, these very harsh realities firsthand. But I think an overarching takeaway from this work really shows how these social realities of reproductive healthcare are produced through communication. Communication, which I defined at the beginning of this presentation, really hinges on how we are related to each other as beings, as very social beings, which has implications on the realities of the equitability, access, care, stigma, disparity, and policies that enable and constrict and ultimately make reproductive healthcare tangible as a communicative concept. So like any study, and I'll spend a few minutes on this, and I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. So like any study, this study does have limitations, several limitations. So first, the study was originally built around conducting ethnographic on-the-ground research at an abortion clinic and crisis pregnancy center in the same community. COVID had a very severe effect on the study, and I quickly had to adapt and accommodate for virtual semi-structured interviews. So second, the majority of the participants I recruited identified as female. Male and non-binary perspectives on what constitutes reproductive healthcare were largely missing from this study. Male and non-binary perspectives, I argue, are important to capture because men and non-binary folks have a significant stake in reproductive healthcare. They are, of course, reproductive beings, and ultimately investigating how reproductive healthcare is constituted from male and non-binary perspectives could add additional complexity to the future iterations of this study. So ultimately, there were also methodological and theoretical limitations. I'll talk very briefly about this. So recruitment efforts were mostly directed toward rights, justice, and health organizations and CPCs. Other perspectives from across Texas were lacking other different perspectives. So, and also this study was very much exclusive in Texas. So a broader range of experiences across perhaps the southeastern region of the US or even broader might have made it more complex. The map representation that I presented here today and in this project is but one example of the many different representations and interpretations of Texas's reproductive healthcare landscape. And theoretically, I have not necessarily really explored the full implications that contribute to the constitution and the materialization of how we talk about reproductive healthcare. And I think future studies can also contribute to that as well. So to conclude, there are several future directions, three of which I identify here. The first one is actually doing the research that I intended to do, really being on the ground in an abortion clinic and CPC located in the same community. I'm also very interested in the repro space as a contested space of complaint, drawing specifically from testimonials of folks who work in this space, really understanding how complaints manifest and how complaints are really understood and talked about within this space. Drawing from Sarah Ahmed, who is an independent scholar, her notion of complaint, I think would be really interesting to understand how repro workers navigate their professional and personal identities a little bit more in depth. And then finally, I would love to include, again, like I mentioned in my limitations, more of that male and non-binary perspective through additional interviews to further contextualize this study. So at this point, I would like to open it up for questions and comments. I see there are quite a few in the chat and I'm very excited to explore them and dig into them. But thank you everybody so much for attending this talk today, for listening to me speak about my project. I very much appreciate your time. So I'm looking in the chat and I think I can go ahead and answer and read out some of the questions with the 10 minutes that we do have left, if that is okay. Good. Okay, great. So Erica asks, yes, she asks, or they ask, this is a very useful framework. Where are you taking this next? How are you planning to apply it? Or is this a bookend of your work on this framework? So the framework, I don't want to wrongfully assume, is this specifically about the entire study, the intimate mapping framework? Is this about all of the study or one part of the study? I guess I could answer to both, which might be interesting. So I will first talk to the intimate mapping framework. I am actually trying to make the intimate mapping interactive. I'm trying to make it an interactive tool that I could share with folks, not only across Texas, but also make it an open access resource for folks in the repro space. I think, one of the critiques that I got about the map is that, the map is all fine and good. It seems more so like a very visual, pretty thing than anything else. But I do disagree. I think the map provides an interesting interpretation of how we understand space and place and geography, how we understand distances and time. So I think I'm again working toward making the map an interactive map, something that can be actually tangibly used by folks. So I'm excited to be doing that as a next step, and I would love to share it with organizations and members who are very interested in that. But for the purposes of this study, I'm currently located in Philadelphia now. I am no longer in Texas. I have since moved, and I'm trying to gather and galvanize organizations within the Philadelphia area and help them with their initiatives and causes that they are championing here in the city by presenting my research to them, by making tangible efforts and initiatives to help them with their campaigns, specifically around how we talk about reproductive healthcare. So I'm trying to really what the problem with doing research like this is that oftentimes it does just end up in academic journals behind a paywall, not accessible to folks who absolutely need it and who can benefit. And so my mission is to, before even publishing or doing that academic jazz, if you will, I'm trying to actively help organizations here, specifically now within Philadelphia, in a very tangible way, because that is what this work is meant to be. It's not meant to be living in a journal for access, for specific folks to access. It's meant to be openly accessed and openly talked about and shared with people who need it. So I'm trying to really lift this work off in the Philadelphia area in very tangible advocacy initiative type projects and activities. So Anne asks, new in abortion work / spent the last 20 years in HIV work, it feels like there's less of a focus on the conversation of repro healthcare about sexual health and pleasure promotion in the way that I hear it discussed in HIV circles. In your mapping work, did you find a domain within your repro healthcare framework that held space for sexual health pleasure promotion? Is that a part of the discourse with different language? I didn't find that come, that's really interesting, Anne. I did not find that come up. I did not find that came up in my conversations with my interviewees. I will disclose that I actually did not ask pointed questions related to space and geography and place. These naturally came up in my interviews just naturally and organically in conversation. And I think asking more pointed questions about geography and about mapping might open up different conversations, as you suggest, with sexual health and pleasure promotion. It might open up different avenues for speaking about time, place, and space and geography. And again, I think if I asked more specific questions related to the mapping and the mapping efforts, I might have gotten more detailed experiences related to questions around geography and experiences around geography and time and space and place. Absolutely. And there's so much, I think there's so much promise. I had a lot of fun with the mapping again and again. I think there is a lot of promise there. It's not just this visual pretty tool. I think it does have a purpose, and I think it can be accessible to folks who oftentimes forget how challenging distances are, not only in Texas, but across the US. Every state has its distance and space and place challenges, and I think an intimate mapping effort, maybe perhaps of the entire country or or specific regions of the US, might offer some different perspectives, specifically how we talk about reproductive health care and how we do repro work. Erica says the information needs to be pretty and visual. It does, in order to be accessible and to be appealing and eye-catching. I definitely do agree. Yeah, I definitely do agree. It is, yeah, and I think it is a better form too. I think it's digestible. I think the eye-catching part of the map brings attention to people, and I think once I build out the interactive map, I think it'll be an interesting experience. So I'm excited to do that and continue to work on that. Well, my email and my Twitter handle are on this thank you page, so please connect with me. I would love to hear from you. I would love to continue these conversations with you. Again, thank you, Kimberly, and thank you to the Take Root Conference for giving me a platform to share my work. I am so privileged and honored to have had this space to do so. But again, thank you all for listening. Please connect with me. I would love to hear from you again. And I will see you around the conference this weekend.